This is the second installment of a presentation on prediction science, only this time it's going to focus
more on COVID-19 and health, among other things.
It's always good to give a little backstory of how we got here. And you might think it's because we're scientists, but that's not true at all. It's actually for a different reason.
We are very competitive. So yes, we're a couple, but we challenge each other all the time. And we bet against each other all the time.
And we had a particular bet having to do with the Texas primary this year.
We had different ideas of who was going to win the primary in Texas. One of us thought it would be Joe Biden that would win the primary.
And the other thought it was Bernie Sanders based on the fact that he was leading in all the polls. So one of us won, and they had a secret weapon. And what was that?
One of us looked at Google search interest. So how many people Google the name Joe Biden and how many people Google the name Sanders
in Texas
before the election.
And as you can see, we looked at this, or rather the individual who won looked at it, because that individual knew that Google search interest with about 80 to 85% accuracy predicts who's going to win a political primary in the United States. The more the search, the more chance you're going to win. And here you see that Biden made a late surge, probably by undecided voters who were checking him out.
Just the last couple of days. So if you look at the search interest just 1 month before the election or 1 week before the election, you're going to think Sanders is going to win. But if you just look the last couple of days, then you see Biden is surging.
So one of us won and the other one lost.
That's right.
Yes. Okay, so here's what we're going to talk about as we take you into the future.
So we're going to talk about the opportunities
for doing this kind of prediction using new tools.
And the art of the possible. We are especially going to emphasize things about coronavirus and health.
And then we're going to end with a short treatise on our predictions for where prediction science itself is going. So let's first talk about the opportunities that technology is providing.
The web and mobile connections have instrumented most of the global population, permitting big data insights never before possible.
You know, Dr. Chris, in another way of saying that, it used to be that scientists needed to do inferential statistics from small populations to predict what might happen with big populations. But what's happened now is we can do descriptive statistics. We don't have to guess. We can sample the entire world.
That's right. And behavioral and data scientists are using those insights to make ever more accurate sociological, technological, and economic predictions, such as future stock market moves, which would be very interesting financially for all of us.
Yes, and the stock market stuff in particular, since most of us work in and around the government, we don't make a lot of big bucks. And so maybe this is a way to do that. And then the key thing here too is that as smart as we are, God knows we're smart, we're not data scientists. We're really amateurs when it comes to data science, but we are interested in certain scientific questions. And so basically these tools are things that anybody can use. Okay, we'll go to the next slide.
We're trying to get to the next slide.
We're trying to get to the next slide.
I think you need to get this back.
Okay, there we go.
So we're using free tools that are available to everybody. One of them is Google Trends. When we look at the amount of Google search on a particular term, and that can be in a specific country, in a specific district, and that could be over a certain period of time. That can vary.
Yeah, Wikipedia page views is interesting. They do the same thing, but they give you the actual raw numbers of searches, which can be interesting. And speaking of Wikipedia, Wikipedia has been converted to an ontology, an OWL-type format, and with edges and nodes that can be searched with a new tool called Sparkle that looks for meaning and relationships as opposed to just keyword search.
And you need a lot of details for Sparkle. That's still a little bit difficult to use, but it's definitely coming out.
Those of you who know SQL can use it easily. If you don't, well, you should get someone who does.
Yes. So we can also use the home of the US government's open data. It will give us a lot of detail about agriculture, climate, ecosystem, education, energy, health, you name it, a lot of indications.
And the interesting thing is to look with the ontology at linkages among these different things. For example, weather, agriculture, and health have interesting linkages.
So we're going to give you examples of what is possible.
So the first thing has to do with the stock market. An article appeared in Nature magazine in which they looked at thousands of different terms to see which ones, when they were on search with Wikipedia or Google, could predict moves in the stock market. And lo and behold.
And one of the word is depth. When people search on depth, more than it precedes market downturns.
Right. And so Wikipedia was another one of these. And, it occurred to one of us, we aren't saying which one, maybe it was the one who actually won the bet about Biden versus Sanders, that, gee, in Wikipedia, there aren't that many searches. So an individual could do a lot of searching.
And search on depth to see if they can influence the stock market.
Right, because the quants, for sure, on Wall Street read about this, included it in their quant model. So could you drive the stock market down by just doing a lot of searches on depth, take puts in the futures index market, and stay out of Leavenworth prison?
We were not going to talk about what happened.
We're not going to talk about what happened. Yeah,
No.
yeah. So no questions on that particular one.
But we looked at the predictive moves in the financial markets. So when we look at the amount of cell phones that are in some financial districts, we can see.
Well, this was data that was collected by a company called Sense Networks out of MIT that was since bought by Yellow Pages, and they tracked the geo of anonymized self data. And what they found is that by looking at financial districts and the pattern of life, where people went, how long they were there, who they hung out with, they could see anomalies in that data that would predict upturn and downturns in financial markets, particularly those that were centered in and around San Francisco.
You can see in the middle of the slide, there is a high activity. So when people stay late at night in a financial district, when they order a lot of late pizza or meals, then something is going on and the markets are going to move.
And this just isn't just mobile handsets, it's also mobile data from taxi dispatch, police, and so forth. A spinoff of that company, Thasos Group, is in the business of using mobile data to predict market moves for hedge fund managers and to help people like shopping malls. Here's an example of economic activity in shopping malls shown in red.
So, and you see the Thasos signal in blue, and you can compare those two. So Thasos signal and what is really happening are really correlated.
And I guess the motto here is where the foot traffic goes, the money will follow.
Now, what about oil prices? Well, we can predict spot oil prices from the refinery problems by looking at where the cell phones are. And you can see on the slide on the left, all those little green dots are individual cell phones.
And you can also see that's the normal pattern. And you can start to see when there's decrease in activity, like a huge maintenance problem that shuts down production, and you see that on the right, you could take positions in spot oil market and do pretty well. This stuff is legal right now.
Yeah, see when, and that could be a bow wave, when you see there is much less very reduced activity in refineries on the right, it's abnormal, and then you can tell that the oil prices are going to go up.
Now, you just used the term bow wave. Could you tell our listening audience what that means?
Well, we're going to talk about this a little bit further, but—
Oh, tease, you're such a tease.
Yes, we're going to tease, yes.
Okay, so more about bow waves later.
Yes.
This is an interesting study that was done trying to predict social unrest by looking at, in electronic news and blogs and social media, the food prices, and also the actual food prices that you can get locally on the internet for local markets. And what they found is that when there's a sudden rise in food prices, it's very likely you're going to get some riots and some social unrest. Interesting thing to look at now in our own country with coronavirus.
That's right. So now we're going to talk more about coronavirus, talk about the early warnings. We're going to track the spread, and we're going to talk about tracking the population's response.
So before it happens, when you know it's happened, what do you do? And then how are people reacting to it? So let's talk about Google search again. And this is an article I just published 2 days ago, which was the #1 most popular one on Psychology Today for a while. And the title of that was Mysterious Blips Raise Questions About Coronavirus Timeline. And in that article, which you can get if you're interested, I talk about Nature magazine just came out with a few days ago a report that said that the virus jumped from animals to humans around October to early December.
So we were curious about seeing if there was any increased Google search on the term coronavirus or on the term SARS in Wuhan, for example, in early October.
And what we found is very interesting. We found that as compared to China, where there was this kind of normal interest, although there was a blip in the term SARS in Beijing, as you can see there on the left, in Hubei province, there was a blip out there in October and September. On Wikipedia, where you can actually see the raw number of searches, there was a huge spike over a 2 to 3 day period in mid-October, which coincidentally is the outside point at which the nature scientists believe that the virus first jumped from animals to humans. So we look at these as potential bow waves, and the so what here is that in the future we should track these kind of things to see if we see them coming.
Yeah, but then I said, well, let's see if there's any wave that were before that. Maybe we could search on what happened between the end of 2018 and the end of 2019, see if there was any other waves, or see people were searching on that also.
Yeah, and in fact, we did find, as you see here in Wikipedia, 2013, 2014, there were periodic jumps, as you see here. And so we have to say, to be rigorous scientists, that all of these things could be statistical anomalies or not. And so we looked at Wikipedia, and I don't show it here, but it's in my article. We looked at other searches that were related, and then what happened when the search volume actually did increase, and what was the spacing between them. And the conclusion is that there probably is something going on here, but not certainly. And anyhow, these are bow waves that maybe you can see things coming even in a state that does censorship. Speaking of which, we looked at the cell phones, the outflow of people from Wuhan. That's in January, after the Solar New Year vacation, and see if there was a relationship between the outflow of mobile cell phone and the diagnosed cases. So the circles. The large circles are the increase in disease. So the bigger the circle, the more the cases. The darker the blue, the more the outflow. And there is a strong correlation between where people went from Wuhan during the Lunar New Year celebrations and the amount of cases in different parts of China. So again, if you want to do a bow wave of, hey, where is disease going to go? Just watch where people are going. And that raises an interesting question. Google, for example, and Waze and others look at traffic patterns. When you see an increase in traffic, you could then predict potentially sometime later that there's going to be an increase in cases of coronavirus. Here we have 3 charts of 3 different countries, and it tracks the progression of the disease shown in
on the same time base. So you see China, Italy, and the US, and the 3 of them are based on the same time. And you can see in China, there was a peak in search.
Shown in dark blue.
In January 27th. And then the disease that you can see peaks a month later, which is in turquoise. And then in Italy, a little lower, the search peaks in early March. And then the disease is going to peak later in mid-April. And then lower, you have the US, where the search peaks in mid-March. And then the disease is peaking actually now in mid-May.
Yeah, and this is an interesting chart from a number of points of view. Notice that the curves are flattening. When you go from China to Italy to the US, they get flatter. But as they get flatter, the peak moves out in time. And another way of saying is that notice too that the distance between the peak search volume and the peak in cases stretches out the flatter the curve. So the flatter the curve, the better predicted value of the Google search interest. So it's kind of interesting. You can actually follow the wave as it moves across the world. You can follow it in search volume, and you can follow it in actual number of cases, and it's starting to tell a story. Now, that raised an interesting question, getting back to us being a little bit competitive. One of us said, oh, wow, India is this huge country and they don't have many cases despite they have 1.x billion people. That's really cool.
And the other one of us says, but of course they don't have many cases because they took appropriate actions right away with stay-at-home orders for everybody in the whole country as soon as they had the first cases.
So the other one said, baloney. Don't believe the figures from India at all. So the other person said, well, smarty pants, if you think that Google search is a good index of how much there's actually disease there, let's go look and see if there was less search in India that might correlate with actual less disease. So what we did is we plotted the relative search interests, and this took a little bit of tradecraft. We came up with more neutral terms like weather and things that have a pretty common steady search interest. And then we looked at the search volume and did that ratio. And that gives us the search interest. And then we put on the same chart the deaths per million. And what you can see is that actually India had both low search interest and low number of cases, as did New Zealand globally, and interestingly, Iran.
And when you see on the right, the extreme right and up, Italy and Spain had a lot of search interest and a lot of death per million.
But US, interestingly, had very low search interest, but fairly high death rate, as we all know.
Yeah.
So now we'll talk about tracking the data. There's an outfit called Unicast that uses mobile data in a different way. They're looking at social distancing. And they have come up with a report card. This one is as of today. And what it shows is that the southern tier of states in a belt across the Midwest get an F. They're not doing social distancing very well. And you can actually see by county, and interestingly, LA County, where we live, gets an F. And we also have, coincidentally, by far the highest per capita rate of COVID in the country. And so the natural question.
So we compared, are the people, the states in which there are less social distancing, are they the ones in which there are a higher rate of infection? So we compared the two, and so on the left, the social distance score, the orange is F, the worst one. And on the right, the rate of infection, you can see it correlates.
It does correlate. And New England is interesting in that you see there in Connecticut and then above it in Massachusetts, they have among the very highest infection rates, and they are among the poorest in social distance. So let's shift the conversation from mass populations to you as individuals. Is there something that can be sensed that's a bow wave in your own body that will tell you if you're going to be infected and how severe it is?
Yes, there are wearables. A lot of us wear Apple Watch or different watches that will give us the heart rate, also how much we move. And there are certain apps that can give you your oxygen level. So depending on those levels, we notice that when people start to have an accelerated heart rate, a decreased motion, and when they measure their oxygen level, sometimes it's low.
That's blood oxygen saturation.
Yes. Then there's more infections.
Yes, Scripps at UC San Diego did research on thousands of Fitbit wearers and others and found out that the correlation with these indices that we show here on the left with actual outbreak of influenza-like illness, ILI, as they call it, over many states, over many years, there was a very high correlation. So the bottom line is that not too far off in the future, your smartwatch can tell you, gee, you might want to get tested because you're starting to show the bow wave signals of a serious infection.
And you might not even notice it. You might not be aware of it, but your heart rate will show and your decreased motion will show.
Speaking of not being aware of it, I have to, get some neuroscience in here. And it turns out that you have this thing called the vagus nerve that innervates your heart and various other viscera. And we now know that the immune system communicates directly with the nervous system. These cytokines, which are inflammatory type proteins, send signals to the vagus nerve, which modulate its activity up or down, which is a precursor to having an infection. So your vagus nerve knows you're about to get sick before you do. True, there are no wearables right now that will interface to your vagus nerve, but there could be.
Exactly. How do you measure the activity in your vagus nerve?
Well, you just put a little device in your collarbone. That's what could be simpler. Let's turn the conversation now to looking at other sources of information, primarily electronic news, social media, blogs, and so forth that have been harvested.
So so there are digital bow waves of plant disease, but also animal disease and human disease. One of those projects is called Project Argus. I'm sure a lot of people have heard about it, which gives indirect indicators of what is happening. For example, we talk about school closures, and also road closures could be a bow wave, which is an early indicator of something happening.
Poultry culling. Certain people in Vietnam, for example, in 2009 started commenting on, gee, why are all these geese and ducks lying around dead in the farmland?
And also food shortages, so we've talked about this before, that can bring riots.
Price gouging, black market activity whenever there's scarcity, increase in smuggling activity.
And also when there are plant disease, people use more pesticides. So there was pesticide shortages, and since there are shortages, people make at home their own pesticides.
So purchases for ingredients of homemade pesticides. And speaking of which, you might be wondering what that little critter is on the right. You've heard about the murder hornet, but have you heard about the nefarious pest, the plant hopper? The plant hopper, it's no joke actually. Chris thinks it looks cute, but in Vietnam, it's not cute at all because it destroys the rice crop. And in 2009, there was a horrible infestation. The data coming out of Vietnam was not very forthcoming, but indirect data showed that there were increased suicide rates because of farm failures, shortages of drugs, home pesticides, changes in travel and migration. And in the case of the plant hopper, infrastructure overload, where people were coming to get rice to feed their families because they couldn't grow the rice.
Yeah, and recently there was a virus attacking tomatoes in France. That's a very recent.
Really, that was a lot of tomatoes.
Yeah, exactly.
Yeah, okay, all right. So there are other indicators. For example, in China, when they put people under what they call controlled quarantine, you have to stay in a hotel. You can, I talked about increased, yeah.
The work shortages?
Yep, talked about that. I just said real fast.
Oh, no. Well, I want to spend more time with that.
Okay.
So when people are sick, they're going to buy more Tylenol, they're going to have the use of more antibiotics or cough syrup. So those will be in shortages. So we need to pay attention to that. Also, people will travel to safer countries. If there is an outbreak in the main town, then they will go to the countryside. So we pay attention to travel. Like at the beginning of the coronavirus, there was an outbreak in the north of Italy. So people traveled to the south of Italy. They wanted to get out. We need to pay attention to that. The infrastructure overload, for example, when hospitals are overloaded with patients. You talked about the rice shortages overloaded.
Yes, and as I was saying, in China, they put people in hotels, and you can find out whether there's an anomaly in hotels just by getting on Expedia or Orbitz or Hotel.com and looking at price and availability. And if there's a significant change, you know something's going on.
Like you cannot get any room in your favorite Wuhan hotel. That means there must be something going on in Wuhan. Also, you can look at the mobile data pattern in the hotel. Is everybody staying inside their hotel room without moving, or are people moving? If they're not moving, something is going on.
And sewage is interesting because in China, the authorities mandated that you dump disinfectant in the sewage, which is detectable in its own right, but also it changes the local bugs, what we call the flora.
Yeah, actually, you're required to put disinfectant in the toilet after each poop or each pee. But before the outbreak, you were not required to do that. So before the outbreak, you had a certain flora in the sewage. And now with the outbreak at the beginning, you would have a change in flora. And now with the disinfectant in the toilets, you'll have much less. You will have no more flora in the sewages. And that, whether it's too much bugs or too little, is significant.
And also the nature of the bugs. When you get disease like you have with coronavirus, it does affect the GI tract. Can everybody hear us okay? We haven't heard any questions.
Oh, yeah, you're good. You do have some questions here. And I wanted to make a comment on the biome, Eric. There's actually a company called uBiome where you can send them in samples of your own biome from your